Chapter 3, African Americans, Deculturalization, Transformation, and Segregation. The first slide is citizenship for African Americans. Prior to the Civil War, the debates about citizenship for free African Americans highlighted the belief that the only people who should have full citizenship were whites. National political leaders rejected granting citizenship to African slaves, and native-born free African Americans, they still weren't considered full citizens. In the southern states, free slave citizenship rights were severely restricted. But after the American Revolution, southern states made it difficult for free African Americans to be free truly. State laws denied African Americans the right to vote. The upper southern states made African Americans who were free wear shoulder patches that read free so they could visually see who these people were. Free African Americans were denied the right to jury trials and obtaining legal counsel and testifying in court. The American Revolution promised political equality to free whites, but restricted free blacks in the southern states. In the northern states, denied the right to vote for African Americans except in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine. 1857 Dred Scott decision. The blacks were denied United States citizenship and political rights laid out in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. The 1790 Naturalization Act excluded blacks from achieving natural citizenship. However, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 declared that all persons born in the United States are declared to be citizens of the United States. However, this excluded those who the Indians not taxed. The Naturalization Act of 1870 extended United States citizenship to African Americans or those of African American descent, but still excluded Asians and Native Americans. The 14th Amendment in 1868 had an equal protection clause that provided equal educational opportunities. However, it has still undergone many twists and turns, including segregation in schools. Section 1 of this clause provides constitutional acknowledgement for granting blacks United States citizenship. The United States Supreme Court declared segregation constitutional. The Supreme Court ruled that segregation did not create inferiority as long as the segregated facilities were equal and reasonable. However, the Supreme Court did not define what they meant by equal and reasonable. In the 1880s and 1980s, the citizenship rights of African Americans disappeared due to state laws that curtailed the rights to vote, created segregation, and restricted judicial rights. Full citizenship wasn't truly achieved until the 1950s and 1960s. The Great Crusade for Literacy. In 1863, only 7% of the African American population was literate, but within 90 years, the literacy rate jumped to 90%. After the Civil War, the blacks struggled to establish schools and were assisted by African Americans and missionary teachers from the North, which is a little interesting because we'll get to that later in this PowerPoint. In the 1870s, the percentage of black children in schools was higher than whites. However, in the 1880s, the whites exerted greater control in state political systems. But by the 1890s, many blacks found themselves in conditions similar to slavery. The first efforts to establish schools was made by Black teacher Mary Peak. And Mary Peak organized a school in 1861 at Fortress Monroe, Virginia. In the 1870s, the need for children as farm laborers grew while former slaves were struggling to improve their economic and political positions. Former slaves wanted practical knowledge, such as help dealing with contracts, weights, and measurements. The missionaries wanted to provide them with an education that emphasized morality, and the Southerners wanted to teach them industrial habits just to keep them on the lower rungs of the Southern society. In the 1890s, a division was split within the black community. This division is mainly associated with Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Washington's compromise was that in all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one is the hand in all things essential to mutual progress. Washington believed that once the economic value of blacks had been established, social acceptance would soon follow. And Washington attended Hampton Institute, which had been established by General Samuel Armstrong. Washington was strongly influenced by his vision, and He believed that hard work was the first principle of civilized life, and that through hard work, people learned the right moral habits. He believed that African Americans needed to be educated in the value of hard work if they were to assume their proper place in Southern society. Hampton Institute, which had been established by Armstrong, was to be the agent for civilizing freed slaves. The major resistance to increased school expenditures came from planters. By 1875, the planters' efforts resulted in halting the expansion of schools for African Americans in the South, mainly because the planters considered education as a direct threat to the use of black children as agricultural laborers, mainly because it would cause them to leave menial agricultural work or demand higher wages. By the year 1900, the dream of education for African Americans was completely shattered. The majority of children, 404,225 out of 516,276 children, were employed as farm labor. The segregation of public schools resulted in the denial of education of black children. Resisting segregation. The major resistance to school segregation came from W.E.B. Du Bois, and he also became the leading opponent of Booker T. Washington's Southern Compromise. He claimed that Washington's compromise resulted in disaster for black people in the South, and he also envisioned an education that would provide leaders to protect the social and political rights of the black community. He wanted to develop an Afro-American culture, and this would blend the African background of former slaves with the current American culture of those people. The Second Crusade was a combination of personal donations of time and money. Donations by private foundations and government money were the reasons common schools for black children were finally established. In the Second Crusade, black Southern citizens had to pay tuition for their children to attend schools while paying taxes to support white segregated schools. Anna T. Jean's Fund paid up to 84% of the salaries for teachers, supervisors in elementary and industrial education, and Jean's teachers raised approximately $5 million between the year 1913 and the year 1928. The Julius Rosenwald Fund led the campaign in building schools for black children. It was through struggle and sacrifice that allowed the African American children in the South to finally have a viable system of education. So I want to leave you with this question. How can the denial of an education be used to exploit a population in today's society, and how will you handle this issue in your classroom?